March 22, 1945, 11 p.m. While Hitler sleeps, convinced the Rhine is Germany's unbreakable barrier, George Patton launches canvas boats into darkness at Oppenheim. No preparation, no permission, just 15,000 American soldiers crossing in silence. By dawn, they're across. Germany's mythological moat just hold water. At noon on March 23rd, the news reaches Hitler's bunker. General Jodl enters. Mein Führer, Patton has crossed the Rhine. Hitler freezes. Where? When is Montgomery? Not Montgomery. Patton. Last night. What follows is not human. A raw scream of pure rage echoing through concrete corridors. Lies! Kesselring promised it would hold! Hitler paces like a caged beast, demanding counterattacks from divisions that don't exist. Reserves with no fuel. Miracles that will never come. But Patton isn't listening. He's already building bridges. Already racing toward Berlin. The river that was supposed to buy weeks bought nothing. Hitler's scream changes nothing. This is the story of how one general crossed a river in a single night and made another scream watching his empire drown because George Patton refused to wait. March the 22nd, 1945, 10:47 p.m. The Rhine moves in darkness, not the gentle darkness of a pastoral riverbank, but the heavy, smoke-thickened darkness of a continent tearing itself apart. The water is cold, barely above freezing, and it carries with it the debris of 1,000 shattered bridges, the ash of burned villages, the smell of cordite and wet stone. On the eastern bank, German soldiers crouch in hastily dug positions, their breath visible in the night air, their hands trembling not only from cold. They have been told the Rhine is Germany's last natural barrier, the ancient moat that has guarded the fatherland since the legions of Rome turned back. They have been told it is impassable, under fire, that the Allies will need weeks to prepare, that Montgomery to the north is still assembling his grand crossing with theatrical precision. They have been told many things that are no longer true. Across the water, in the rubble-choked streets of Oppenheim, a small German town now in American hands, combat engineers from Patton's Third Army work with a speed that defies military logic. They are not waiting for orders. They are not waiting for Montgomery. They are not waiting for Eisenhower's permission or Churchill's blessing. They are simply crossing because George S. Patton Jr. has told them to cross, and because they have learned that when Patton says a thing will be done, it is already half finished in his mind. The first assault boats, flimsy canvas things that seem too fragile for a river this wide, this fast, this defended, push off from the western shore at precisely 11 p.m. Inside them, men from the 5th Infantry Division grip their rifles and say nothing. Some pray. Some think of home. Some simply stare into the darkness ahead and wonder if they will see sunrise. The boats are nearly silent, their outboard motors muffled by Army ingenuity and desperation. The oars dip into the Rhine with barely a splash. On the eastern bank, a German sentry hears something. Not the roar of engines or the thunder of artillery. Those sounds he knows, has lived with for months. This is different. A soft mechanical purr, rhythmic and wrong. He raises his hand to signal his sergeant, but before he can speak, the first boat runs aground on German soil, and 30 American infantrymen pour out into the shallows with their weapons raised. By midnight, 200 men are across. By 1 a.m., 600. By dawn, the entire 5th Infantry Division, 15,000 soldiers, will be standing on the eastern bank of the Rhine, and Germany's last barrier will be nothing more than a river again. But the crossing itself is only half the story. The other half is unfolding 200 miles to the east, in a bunker beneath Berlin, where Adolf Hitler is about to receive news that will shatter the carefully constructed illusion he has been living inside for the past 3 months. The Rhine has always been more than a river. It is mythology made, liquid, the boundary between civilization and barbarism in the Roman mind, the liquid spine of German identity. Goethe wrote poems about it. Wagner wove it into his operas. In 1840, when France threatened to reclaim the Rhineland, Germans composed Die Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, a patriotic anthem that promised eternal vigilance, eternal defense. For more than a century, German children grew up singing that no enemy would ever cross the Rhine, while German hearts still beat. By March 1945, many of those hearts have stopped beating. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military force on earth, is now a hollow shell. Its best divisions have been ground to dust in Russia. Its industries have been bombed into rubble by the combined air forces of Britain and America. Its fuel reserves are so depleted that tanks sit motionless in fields, their crews reduced to digging foxholes beside machines that have become steel coffins. And yet the Rhine remains. If nothing else remains, if every city is ash, if every soldier is dead, if every factory is silent, the Rhine will still be there, wide and cold and impassable. This is what German commanders tell themselves in March 1945. This is what they report to Berlin. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, newly appointed commander of German forces in the West, assures Hitler that while the Americans may have reached the Rhine at several points, crossing it under fire is an entirely different matter. The Allies will need pontoon bridges, massive engineering operations, air superiority, weeks of preparation. Montgomery, the cautious Englishman, is planning his crossing for late March with the kind of methodical preparation that resembles an orchestral performance more than a military operation. Searchlights, smoke screens, preliminary bombardments lasting days. Hitler seizes on this. Montgomery's caution confirms what he has always believed about the British. They are exhausted, timid, clinging to the glories of an empire that no longer exists. And if Montgomery needs weeks to cross, then surely the Americans will need at least as long. The Americans are brave, yes, recklessly so, but they lack the British experience, the tactical sophistication. They are cowboys playing at war. This is Hitler's fatal miscalculation. He has never understood George Patton. Patton does not believe in preparation for its own sake. He does not believe in waiting for perfect conditions. He believes in speed, shock, and the offensive spirit. The idea that a soldier moving forward is worth 3 soldiers sitting still. He has believed this since 1918, when he commanded tanks in the Meuse-Argonne and learned that hesitation kills more men than enemy fire. He has believed it through North Africa, through Sicily, through France, and now, standing on the western bank of the Rhine, with the entire German army collapsing before him, he believes it more than ever. On March 22nd, Patton is in his headquarters in a commandeered German house, studying maps by lamplight. His staff officers are debating bridge sites, engineering timelines, casualty projections. Patton listens for exactly 90 seconds, then cuts them off. "We're crossing tonight," he says. There is a moment of stunned silence. "Sir," one of his colonels ventures, "we don't have bridging equipment in place. We have boats," Patton interrupts. "We have men. We have darkness. That's enough." And it is. The soldiers crossing the Rhine that night do not know they are making history. They know only that they are cold, that the river is wider than it looked from the western shore, and that somewhere in the darkness ahead, Germans are waiting with machine guns. The assault boats are designed to carry 12 men each, but some are overloaded with 15, 16, and they ride low in the water, perilously close to swamping. The current is stronger than expected. The Rhine is swollen with early spring snow melt from the Alps, and several boats are swept downstream, their passengers frantically paddling to avoid being carried into German kill zones. Private First Class Robert L. Dunn, 5th Infantry Division, will later recall that the crossing felt surreal, not frightening in the way combat usually is, but strange and dreamlike. "We were so quiet," he writes in his diary. "No one talked. You could hear the water against the boat, the sound of the paddles, and nothing else. It was like we were ghosts crossing into hell." The German response, when it comes, is confused and fragmented. The Wehrmacht has no cohesive defense plan for the Oppenheim sector because, until tonight, Oppenheim has been a quiet backwater, lightly defended by second-rate troops, old men and boys from the Volkssturm, the desperate conscript militia scraped together from Germany's exhausted population. These are not the hardened SS veterans who fought at Normandy or the panzer crews who terrorized Soviet steppes. These are teachers, shopkeepers, factory workers handed rifles and told to hold the Rhine. They try. God knows they try. Machine guns open up from concealed positions along the riverbank, tracers lacing the darkness in bright geometric patterns. Mortar shells begin falling into the water, throwing up geysers of spray. Men in the boats hunch lower, some firing blindly toward the muzzle flashes on shore. One boat takes a direct hit and disintegrates, its occupants thrown into the icy Rhine. Some swim, some sink, dragged down by their equipment. Some are fished out by other boats, coughing up river water and shaking with cold. But the boats keep coming, wave after wave, crossing and recrossing, ferrying men and equipment through the darkness. By 2 a.m., American engineers have established a narrow beachhead on the eastern shore and are beginning to expand it, clearing German positions with grenades and rifle fire. By 3 a.m., the first American tanks are being ferried across on improvised rafts, a desperate, dangerous operation that sees one Sherman slide off its raft and vanish into the Rhine, its crew barely escaping through the top hatches before it sinks. By dawn, the impossible has become routine. 15,000 American soldiers are across the Rhine, digging in, pushing outward, and the German defenders are falling back in disarray. The Great Barrier has been breached, not with Montgomery's grand orchestration, but with Patton's brutal simplicity. Boats, men, darkness, and will. In Berlin, Hitler's day begins at noon. He has been keeping increasingly nocturnal hours, sleeping through mornings, conducting military conferences late into the night in the stifling underground labyrinth of the Führerbunker. His health is deteriorating. His hands shake with a palsy that may be Parkinson's disease, may be the result of the stimulant injections his personal physician administers daily. His left arm hangs useless at his side, damaged by the blast from the July 20th assassination attempt. His face is gray, his eyes sunken, his body stooped like a man 20 years older than his 56 years. But his mind, when it focuses, is still sharp, dangerously sharp, capable of recalling obscure details from military reports filed weeks ago, capable of constructing elaborate strategic fantasies that his generals dare not contradict. He has convinced himself that Germany can still win, not through conventional means, those are gone, but through will, through fanaticism, through secret weapons that are always just weeks away from deployment. The V-2 rockets will break British morale. The jet fighters will sweep Allied bombers from the sky. The new U-boats, equipped with snorkel technology, will starve Britain into submission. All Germany needs is time. The Rhine buys time. This is the logic Hitler has been repeating to himself, to his generals, to anyone who will listen. Montgomery's grand crossing is scheduled for late March, March 23rd or 24th, intelligence suggests. That means Germany has at least another week, maybe two, to shift reserves, to prepare counterattacks, to organize a defense that might stall the Allied advance long enough for political fractures to appear. Stalin and Churchill are already arguing about Poland, about the shape of post-war Europe. Roosevelt is ill, perhaps dying. If Germany can just hold on, if the Rhine can buy just a little more time, the Allied coalition might collapse under its own contradictions. This is what Hitler believes. On the morning of March 23rd, 1945, when General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, enters the map room in the Führerbunker with a face like a funeral mask. Hitler is bent over a map of the Rhine, moving colored pins that represent divisions that no longer exist. He does not look up. Mein Führer, Jodl begins, and something in his voice makes Hitler's hand stop mid-movement. What is it? Jodl places a teletype message on the table. Patton has crossed the Rhine. Hitler straightens slowly. Where? When is Montgomery's operation? Not Montgomery. Patton. Last night, at Oppenheim. He has an entire division across. For a long moment, Hitler says nothing. He stares at the message, at the words that might as well be a death sentence. Oppenheim, a town he has never heard of, a sector of the front he has paid no attention to, because it was supposed to be quiet, irrelevant. And Patton, always Patton, has found the gap, the weakness, the undefended moment. Last night, Hitler's voice is soft, dangerous. Why was I not informed last night? The reports were confused, mein Führer. We did not have confirmation until... Lies! The word comes out as a shriek, and suddenly Hitler is no longer the stooped, trembling old man, but something else, something feral and unhinged. Lies! They are all lying to me. Kesselring promised me the Rhine would hold. He promised me. Jodl says nothing. There is nothing to say. Kesselring did promise. Kesselring believed his own promise. But Patton does not care what German field marshals believe. Hitler begins to pace, his useless arm swinging limply at his side, his good hand clenching and unclenching. How many across? Initial reports suggest 15,000, perhaps more by now. 15,000! Hitler stops pacing, turns to face Jodl. And what reserves do we have to contain them? This is the question Jodl has been dreading. The 6th SS Mountain Division is en route, but it will not arrive for at least, how long? 48 hours, perhaps longer. Fuel shortages. Hitler's scream is wordless, incoherent, a sound of pure rage that echoes through the concrete corridors of the bunker. Officers in adjacent rooms freeze, exchange glances, say nothing. They have heard this before, many times, in recent months, but it never becomes routine, this transformation of their Führer into a screaming, spitting creature of fury. When Hitler finally speaks again, his voice is hoarse. Patton, always Patton. He is a madman, a criminal. He does not fight like a soldier. He fights like a gangster. Jodl carefully. He is effective, mein Führer. Effective? Hitler whirls on him. He is a butcher. He cares nothing for the rules of war, nothing for his own men's lives. He simply attacks, like an animal. This is not warfare. This is barbarism. There is a terrible irony in this accusation, coming from the man who unleashed the Wehrmacht on Poland, who ordered the murder of millions, who has spent the last 6 years turning Europe into a charnel house. But Hitler does not see the irony. In his mind, there is a difference, a meaningful, essential difference between his own actions, which serve a higher purpose, and Patton's, which serve only chaos. Issue orders, Hitler says finally, his voice flat and exhausted. All available. Reserves to Oppenheim. I want that bridgehead crushed. I want Patton thrown back into the Rhine. Mein Führer, with respect, we do not have reserves that can... Then find them! Another scream. Another spray of spittle. Strip them from other sectors. Pull them from Italy. I do not care. Patton must be stopped. Jodl salutes, leaves, carries the impossible orders to commanders who will do their best and fail. Because by the time the orders arrive, Patton will have 2 divisions across, then 3, then 5. And the Rhine, the Great Barrier, the mythological moat, will be just another river, and Germany's last hope will be drowning in its cold, indifferent current. What the German defenders of the Rhine did not understand, what they could not have understood, because it required experiencing the full weight of American industrial power, was that Patton's crossing was not an improvisation born of recklessness. It was the inevitable result of a system that had been designed, from the ground up, to make the impossible routine. American combat engineers in World War II were not merely construction workers in uniform. They were the product of a military doctrine that treated mobility as a weapon, that understood bridges and roads and supply lines as the sinews of modern war. The U.S. Army Engineer School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, had been teaching rapid river crossing techniques since the 1920s, refining them through countless exercises, incorporating lessons learned from every theater of war. By 1945, an American engineer battalion could construct a pontoon bridge capable of supporting Sherman tanks in under 6 hours, a task that would have taken German engineers twice as long, and that British engineers would approach with such methodical caution that the opportunity would have passed. But the engineers were only part of the equation. Behind them stood the most powerful industrial economy in human history, an economy that had spent the past 3 years converting its peacetime capacity into a war machine of almost incomprehensible scale. In 1942, American factories had produced 47,000 aircraft. In 1943, 86,000. In 1944, 96,000. The same exponential growth applied to tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, rifles, boots, rations, and every other commodity of war. By March 1945, the U.S. Army in Europe had more trucks than the Wehrmacht had ever possessed horses, and German logistics still relied heavily on horses, on requisitioned civilian vehicles, on rail lines that were now rubble. This disparity manifested in 1,000 small ways that German soldiers found incomprehensible. An American infantry company that came under fire could call in artillery support within minutes. Not hours, not the next day, but minutes. Because American artillery battalions were motorized, supplied with ammunition in quantities that seemed limitless, coordinated by radio networks that functioned reliably even in the chaos of combat. A German infantry company in the same situation might wait hours for fire support, might receive only a few salvos before the guns fell silent for lack of shells, might receive no support at all because the artillery had no fuel to move, or consider medical care. An American soldier wounded in the Rhine crossing would be evacuated across the river by boat, triaged at a forward aid station, transported by ambulance to a field hospital, equipped with generators, surgical theaters, blood plasma, antibiotics, all within a few hours of being hit. His chances of survival, even with serious wounds, were better than 90%. A German soldier wounded in the same engagement would be lucky to receive even rudimentary first aid. German medical supplies were nearly exhausted. German ambulances had no fuel. German hospitals had been bombed into rubble. Many wounded German soldiers simply bled out in the mud, waiting for help that would never come. This was the reality that German commanders tried to explain to Hitler, and that Hitler refused to accept. He saw Patton's crossing as a failure of will, a collapse of fighting spirit. What he could not see, what his ideology prevented him from seeing, was that will had nothing to do with it. The Wehrmacht was not losing because German soldiers lacked courage or commitment. They were losing because they were being crushed by a system that outproduced them, outmaneuvered them, outthought them at every level. And at the apex of that system, driving it forward with relentless energy, was a man who understood speed better than any commander alive. George S. Patton Jr. is sometimes dismissed as a simple warrior, a man of action rather than thought, all aggression and no subtlety. This is a profound misunderstanding. Patton was, in fact, deeply intellectual, a student of military history who read Caesar's commentaries in Latin, who studied Napoleon's campaigns with the intensity of a scholar, who believed that war was an art form that could be mastered through discipline and meditation. He wrote poetry. He believed in reincarnation, convinced that he had fought in previous lives as a Greek hoplite, a Roman legionary, a Napoleonic hussar. He was strange, eccentric, flamboyant, but he was not simple. What Patton understood, more clearly than almost any of his contemporaries, was that modern war was fundamentally about time. Not just winning, but winning quickly. Not just defeating the enemy, but defeating him before he could react. In Patton's mind, a battle won swiftly with heavy casualties was preferable to a battle won slowly with light casualties, because the slow battle gave the enemy time to regroup, to reinforce, to dig in. Speed saved lives in the aggregate, even if it cost lives in the moment. This philosophy was heresy to many American commanders who had been trained in the methodical, firepower-intensive doctrines favored by the U.S. Army between the wars. But Patton had seen the future in 1940, when German panzers raced through France and destroyed the French army, not through superior numbers or technology, but through superior tempo. The Germans moved faster than the French could think. By the time French commanders realized what was happening, German tanks were already behind their lines, cutting off retreat, turning defensive positions into traps. Patton resolved to out-German the Germans. Throughout 1944, as Third Army raced across France after the Normandy breakout, he pushed his subordinates to move faster, faster, always faster. When logistics officers told him they were outrunning their supply lines, he told them to forage, to capture German fuel depots, to keep moving until the tanks literally ran dry. When infantry commanders complained that their men were exhausted, he told them that the Germans were more exhausted, and that the side that collapsed last would win. And he was right. Third Army's advance across France in August and September 1944 covered more ground more quickly than any army in history, and it broke the Wehrmacht's ability to establish coherent defensive lines in the West. Now, in March 1945, Patton sees the Rhine as the final test of his philosophy. Montgomery is planning a set-piece battle, a crossing so meticulously orchestrated that it cannot fail, but also cannot surprise. Patton sees opportunity in the chaos, in the confusion, in the Wehrmacht's disintegration. He knows that if he can cross before the Germans expect it, before they can concentrate their dwindling reserves, he can turn the Rhine from a barrier into a highway and race into the heart of Germany before Hitler can react. So he crosses at Oppenheim, a town no one is watching, and he does it with an audacity that leaves even his own staff stunned. On the morning of March 23rd, Patton crosses the Rhine himself in an assault boat, accompanied by his aide and a photographer. It is a gesture, a piece of theater, but it is also deeply characteristic. Patton believes that commanders should be visible, should share danger with their men, should embody the offensive spirit they demand from others. When he steps onto the eastern shore, he pauses, unzips his trousers, and urinates into the Rhine, a crude, juvenile gesture that will appear in a photograph that becomes one of the iconic images of the war. Later, when asked about it, Patton will say simply, "I've been looking forward to that for a long time." That afternoon, Patton places a phone call to General Omar Bradley, his immediate superior and frequent rival. Bradley's headquarters is coordinating the overall Allied advance, trying to manage the competing demands of Montgomery's northern crossing, Patton's surprise attack, and the ongoing operations of the other American armies. "Brad," Patton says, his voice crackling over the field telephone line. "I'm across." There's a pause. Across what? The Rhine. "I crossed last night at Oppenheim. I've got 2 divisions over, and I'm building a pontoon bridge." Another pause. Longer this time. Bradley is processing this information, trying to square it with the operational timeline he thought he understood. "Jesus Christ, George. Eisenhower doesn't know about this yet, does he?" "I thought I'd let you tell him," Patton says. And Bradley can hear the grin in his voice. "I wanted to be sure I was across before Monty jumps off. Wouldn't want him to think he's the only one who can cross a river." Bradley knows that Patton is baiting Montgomery, that this entire operation is partly motivated by the rivalry between the two men, a rivalry that has poisoned Allied command relationships for 2 years. But he also knows that Patton has just achieved something extraordinary, and that the strategic implications are immense. "How many casualties?" Bradley asks. "Negligible. Maybe 24 dead, 100 wounded. The Germans barely knew what hit them." "All right. Good work, George. I'll inform Ike. But for God's sake, don't stop now. Get as many men over as you can before the Germans wake up." "Already on it," Patton says and hangs up. 12 hours later, Montgomery's long-planned Operation Plunder begins, with an artillery barrage that lasts 4 hours, consumes more shells than the entire U.S. Army fired during the First World War, and announces to every German within 50 miles that a crossing is imminent. It's a masterpiece of planning a triumph of logistics, and it is completely unnecessary. Patton has already proven that the Rhine can be crossed with boats and balls, and that German resistance is too weak to stop a determined thrust. But Montgomery gets the headlines. Churchill crosses with British troops and proclaims it a historic victory. Eisenhower sends a congratulatory telegram praising the meticulous planning. And Patton, sitting in his headquarters on the eastern shore of the Rhine, reads the reports and smiles bitterly. He has beaten Montgomery by 12 hours, has crossed with a fraction of the preparation and a fraction of the casualties, and yet Montgomery will be remembered as the conqueror of the Rhine. This, Patton thinks, is how history is written, not by who does it first, but by who does it loudest. For the German soldiers defending the Rhine, the American crossing was not merely a military defeat, it was a psychological rupture, the moment when the last illusions fell away and the raw truth of Germany's situation became undeniable. Lieutenant Hans Woltersdorf, commanding a platoon of Volkssturm conscripts near Oppenheim, will later describe the night of March 22nd in his diary with a tone of numbed disbelief. "We heard the boats in the darkness," he writes, "but we could not see them until they were already ashore. We fired, but it was like firing into fog. They kept coming, more and more of them. We had been told the Rhine was impassable. We had been told the Americans would need weeks, and yet here they were, crossing, as if it were nothing, as if the river were just water and not the blood of Germany. By dawn, Woltersdorf's platoon had been overrun. Half his men were dead or captured. The survivors retreated inland, moving through villages where civilians watched them with expressions were no longer fearful, but simply resigned. The Americans were coming. The war was lost. Everyone knew it now, even if no one dared say it aloud. What struck Woltersdorf most in the days that followed was not the ferocity of the American attack, but its casualness. American soldiers seemed almost relaxed as they advanced, as if they were on a training exercise rather than in combat. They had so much of everything: ammunition, food, fuel, equipment, that they could afford to be wasteful. When they encountered resistance, they did not maneuver around it or assault it with infantry. They simply called in artillery, demolished the position with high explosives, and walked through the rubble. When their tanks ran low on fuel, supply trucks appeared within hours, sometimes minutes. When soldiers were wounded, helicopters appeared to evacuate them. This abundance was more demoralizing than any propaganda. It made the war feel not like a contest between equals, but like a natural disaster, an unstoppable force that German soldiers could no more defeat than they could stop a flood or an earthquake. "We are fighting the future," Woltersdorf writes on March 25th, 3 days after the crossing, "and the future does not care how bravely we die." Other German accounts from this period echo the same themes. A Wehrmacht major, captured on March 27th and interrogated by American intelligence, tries to explain to his captors what the collapse feels like from the inside. "You do not understand," he says. "You think we are beaten because you have better generals, better tactics. But it is not that. It is that you have everything. Your soldiers eat better than our officers. Your trucks are newer than our tanks. You throw away in one day more ammunition than we receive in a month. How do you fight an enemy like that? How do you even imagine victory?" The interrogator, a captain from the Bronx, who has seen his share of combat, does not know how to answer this question. He has spent years being told that the Germans are supermen, fanatical warriors fighting for a twisted but deeply held ideology. And now this major sits across from him, exhausted and unshaven, talking about logistics as if logistics were philosophy. But the major is right. By March 1945, the war in Europe is no longer being decided by bravery or ideology. It is being decided by production tables, by shipping manifests, by the ability of American factories to churn out more of everything than the Axis powers can destroy. And Germany, blockaded, bombed, bled white by years of war on multiple fronts, has nothing left to give. In the weeks following the Rhine crossing, Patton's Third Army advances deeper into Germany at a pace that seems almost leisurely compared to the desperate fighting of previous months. German resistance is sporadic, disorganized, half-hearted. Entire divisions surrender en masse. In some towns, white flags appear before American troops even arrive. The Wehrmacht is not retreating. It is disintegrating. Patton pushes his forces toward Czechoslovakia, toward Bavaria, toward the rumored Alpine Redoubt where Hitler is supposedly planning a last stand. The Alpine Redoubt is a myth, a fantasy conjured by Nazi propaganda and believed by Allied intelligence, but it motivates operations for weeks. Along the way, Third Army liberates concentration camps, stumbles into horrors that even hardened combat veterans find incomprehensible. The cheerful, aggressive tone that has characterized Patton's leadership for 2 years becomes, briefly, something else, something grim and silent. But the operational tempo does not slow. Patton keeps driving east, keeps pushing his divisions forward, because he knows that the war is a race now, not against Germany, which is finished, but against the Soviet Union. The Red Army is advancing from the east, and the final geography of Europe's division is being determined by who reaches which cities first. Patton wants to reach Berlin. He wants to reach Prague. He believes that stopping short, allowing the Soviets to occupy Eastern Europe, will be a betrayal of everything the war was fought for. Eisenhower disagrees. The decision has already been made at the highest levels. Berlin is in the Soviet zone of occupation, and American forces will halt at the Elbe River. Patton is furious, but he obeys. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders, and the war in Europe ends with American and Soviet soldiers shaking hands across the ruins of the Third Reich. Patton is not present at the surrender. He is with his troops, somewhere in Bavaria, preparing for what he believes will be the next war, the inevitable conflict with the Soviet Union. He does not live to see that conflict. In December 1945, he is seriously injured in a car accident and dies of complications shortly thereafter, convinced to the end that he has been betrayed by politicians who do not understand the realities of power. But his crossing of the Rhine remains, a moment of perfect clarity in the chaos of war's end, a demonstration of what speed and will and overwhelming material power can achieve. It is the moment when Hitler's last hope died, when the myth of the Rhine as an impassable barrier shattered, when the outcome of the war became mathematically inevitable. In the Führer bunker, in the final weeks of April 1945, Hitler spends his remaining days in a state that those around him can only describe as a waking dream. He moves phantom armies on maps, issues orders to divisions that no longer exist, plans offensives that will never be launched. Sometimes he rages, sometimes he weeps, sometimes he retreats into memories of the 1930s, when Germany was rising and the future seemed limitless. He never mentions Patton's crossing directly in the surviving records of those final days, but it is there, implicit in every conversation about the Western Front, in every report of American forces driving deeper into Germany, in every discussion of where the end will come. The Rhine was supposed to buy time. Patton took that time away. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet shells fall on the streets above the bunker, Hitler takes his own life. Germany survives him by 8 days. Years later, historians will debate what moment marked the true end of Nazi Germany: the fall of Stalingrad, the D-Day landings, the failure of the Ardennes offensive. But for the men who fought in the West, for the German soldiers who watched American boats cross the Rhine in the darkness and knew that nothing would stop them, the answer is simple. The war ended on March 22, 1945, when George Patton proved that rivers are just water, that barriers are just geography, and that the Wehrmacht had nothing left to stop a force that refused to wait. There's a recurring image in the American memory of World War II. The soldier crossing the river, wading through cold water with his rifle held above his head, pushing toward the opposite shore against enemy fire. It appears in photographs, in films, in paintings. It is iconic, not because it is unique. Armies have been crossing rivers since warfare began, but because it represents something essential about the American experience of that war. The crossing is not inevitable. Men die in crossing. Boats sink. Bridges collapse. Entire operations fail when the defenders are strong enough, when the current is too fast, when the plan is too ambitious. But the crossing is attempted anyway, because on the other side is victory, is liberation, is the end of something terrible, and the beginning of something that might possibly be better. Patton understood this in a way that transcended tactics or strategy. He understood that the Rhine was not really about the Rhine. It was about momentum, about maintaining the offensive spirit, even when every rational calculation said to stop and prepare. He understood that wars are won not by the side that makes the fewest mistakes, but by the side that recovers from mistakes fastest, that keeps attacking even when exhausted, that refuses to let the enemy breathe. And behind Patton, making his audacity possible, was a nation that had spent 4 years transforming itself into the greatest military-industrial power in human history, a nation that could produce more ships, more planes, more tanks, more ammunition than any conceivable enemy could destroy, A nation that could feed its soldiers steak and ice cream, while enemy soldiers starved. A nation that could build a pontoon bridge across a major river in 6 hours and consider it routine. This was what Hitler could not understand, what the entire Nazi ideology prevented him from understanding. He had built his worldview on the belief that will and racial purity could overcome material disadvantages, that superior men led by a superior leader could defeat any odds. The Rhine crossing proved him wrong. Will mattered, yes. The men in those assault boats needed enormous courage to push off into darkness and enemy fire. But will alone was not enough. Behind the will stood factories, railroads, oil fields, farms, and entire continents' worth of resources mobilized for a single purpose. Hitler screamed when he heard about Patton's crossing because he knew in that moment that everything was over. Not just the Rhine, not just the war, but the entire architecture of lies he had built his life around. The crossing was not a defeat. It was an annihilation of meaning, a proof that everything he had believed was ash. And on the western bank of the Rhine, in the ruins of Oppenheim, American combat engineers continued working through the night, building bridges, ferrying tanks, expanding the bridgehead, utterly indifferent to the philosophical crisis unfolding 200 miles to the east. They were just doing their jobs, building roads to victory, one river at a time. The Rhine flowed on, cold and indifferent, carrying the debris of a fallen empire toward the sea.